This is a very staunch attempt to keep to the time, and so allow me to introduce you to Earl. Earl is the one in the dress. He, together with some biological females, featured in a beauty contest during this year's annual Pahiyas Harvest Festival in Lukban, Quezon Province. The dress, however, does not feature in beauty pageants alone. It is worn not merely at festivals or by people of wealth and power. It is a dress system which has survived not merely because of some romantic insistence on tradition, but because of its ambivalent, if not colorful history. And you must forgive me, from here on, there might not be an audio-video lock between what I'm reading and the images that you see on the screen. How do we imagine history when much of the archival materials have not yet been digitized? In the chronicling and retelling of Philippine art history, which is where I'm coming from, there are many voices in the present that interface with even more voices from the past. There are also voices which, in the terminology of one of the leading exponents of post-colonial theory, Professor Gayatri Spivak, will remain subaltern. In the relatively short history of Philippine painting, and by short I mean less than 2 centuries, both artists and subject can no longer speak. Only the artifact of art, the representation, the painting itself, remains to speak in their behalf. It is difficult to define, much less characterize, what is Philippine painting when artists, art historians, critics, radical art movements, and other allied institutions from the Philippine art community can never come to a consensus. Florina Capistrano Baker, a scholar of Philippine fashion, poses that our dress system has always been a hybrid, resonating another post-colonial luminary, Professor Homi Baba's concept of hybridity. She argues that in the Philippine case, post-colonial hybridity is not a static state of being, but a strategy of becoming, an ongoing stratagem of creating and defining self. She investigates the notion of hybridity within the theoretical frame of postmodernism, interrogating as well the dichotomy between visual or cosmetic versus structural hybridity and how these strategies are deployed in local global contexts. John Clark, an Australian scholar of Asian art, speaks of Philippine secular paintings as a product of transfer from colonizer to the colonized, and often with the use of force. There is, however, a recurring image that seems to haunt, as it were, the canvases of our Filipino painters. And this is the image of the Filipina wearing the Philippine dress. Philippine paintings can provide new insights into our culture and generate new bodies of knowledge that can go beyond formalist interrogations of iconography and meaning production. They can provide insights into how women during the colonial past were imaged, imagined, and represented, as well as providing us with metaphors of identity, class, and the intangible cultural heritage that is locked within the narrative of a painting. For no other subject matter in Philippine art has quite enjoyed the kind of widespread depiction as that of the Filipina wearing the colonial dress. From the first unschooled painters of the 1820s all the way up to the present, there has never been a time that the Filipina wearing the colonial dress was ever absent in Philippine paintings. The Philippine dress is not a costume. Essentially, it refers to 4 items of clothing for women composed of a baro or blouse, a saya or a longish ankle-length skirt, a tapis or a piece of cloth to cover the skirt, a fichu or a short triangular shawl worn over the blouse to cover the bosom, a dress system which begs the obvious question, why is she dressed that way? It is almost as if there was a conscious effort to hide her in layers of clothing, notwithstanding the heat of the tropics where the Filipina resides. It is called the baro at saya in Tagalog, or the terno, referring to the matching material of the blouse and skirt, which is very different from its more contemporary association with the dress style of a former First Lady. Paintings depicting the Filipina wearing the Philippine dress is like art depicting art, filling a gap in the study of the history of Philippine clothing as an art form. Art historians have traced the development of the styles of Philippine paintings, but not quite about the development of the style of the Philippine colonial dress, and how the dress form itself features in the way painters of the colonial period, where almost always men, viewed the Filipina, and how the dress form has become a habitus, or what according to Pierre Bourdieu is repeated unconscious bodily behavior. In this case, the repeated conscious or unconscious depiction of the Filipina in colonial dress, which translates to aspects of Philippine material culture and ultimately identity. Stuart Hall, a renowned scholar of cultural studies, presents the identity of the average Caribbean person as having three présences or three presences. The présence caribbean, the présence European, and the présence Américain. This fascinating trope of identity is so much akin to the Filipino colonial experience, and as such, one could apply it to Philippine painting depicting the Filipino dress, wherein representations would carry an Asian presence. More specifically, I think Chinese, which is what I'm trying to embrace personally, my Chinese self. There is, of course, the Spanish or European presence and the American presence, who feature in our colonial history. Thus, the silhouette of the skirt is European, the loose embroidered blouse is Asian, and the protective tapis over the skirt, which resembles an Indian sari, is Asian, and the short shawl over the bosom, or panuelo or alampay, is Mexican, in inspiration, as we were once ruled from Spain via Mexico. As the colonial presence shifts from European to American during the turn of the century, the skirt loses its bulbous shape and the shawl is dispensed with. The bell-shaped sleeves become shorter and resemble the wings of a butterfly. Thus, the dress takes on a more modern look, as it could well turn out to be this could very well turn out to be a lesson in Philippine history, Philippine art history. I most humbly beg your indulgence. Before the later part of the 18th century, most Filipino artisans were invariably tied to the church. Painters and sculptors would learn their craft from Spanish friars or Chinese craftsmen to produce religious paintings, icons, and statuaries for the exclusive use of the church. The religious orders served as the first art schools, and the first Filipino paintings were of patron saints and scenes of the Passion, copied from engravings and from paintings which artistic-minded friars must have made to serve as a model for their apprentices. At first, church art was done by Chinese artisans. In 1590, Bishop Salazar of Manila wrote to King Philip II of Spain about the skill of these sanglays, as they were called, by the Spaniards. It appears that the task eventually fell on them, on Chinese artisans, to teach native artists. The Filipino temperament seemed suited to painting, for we hear of Filipino painters taking over the production of religious pictures, while the Chinese did the bulk of the church sculptures. To ply their trade, a painter needed a license, and it was safe to say that only those who were trained by or worked for the religious orders were allowed to paint for the laity. Slowly, however, the beginnings of a secular art were born. The number of painters had grown so large that the church could not employ them all. Besides, changes in attitude brought about by the increasing prosperity and the rise of a native middle class alongside an officialdom composed partly of half Spaniards were demanding a more liberal use of the painter's talents. In 1785, after about 200 years of tight church control, Charles III issued an edict permitting Filipino painters to practice their art without the need of ecclesiastical permission. But even before this, they must have been receiving commissions on the sly. The dispensations merely recognized an existing fact, namely that painting had become secularized. The earliest example of secular paintings in the Philippines was that of an unschooled artist named Esteban Villanueva, who painted the Basi Revolt series of 14 paintings. And may I just go back into that. Of course, it's done in the naive style. And this is the, it's only a portion of the 14th panel of that said painting. It was commissioned by the Spanish colonial government of the Ilocos provinces, and the said painting gave a chronicle narration of the main episodes of the battle or a revolt among Basi or sugarcane winemakers who rebelled against the Spanish imposition of a tax on this particular alcoholic beverage, ending in the execution of rebel leaders, which actually is part of this panel. And their relatives, of course, claiming their bodies. You don't see you don't see it here, but this is the topmost portion of the painting depicting the local principalia or the local elite. And you see that they're better clothed actually. The women are in layers of clothing, and they're looking on as the members of the family of the dead rebels claim the bodies of the dead. Notice that the dresses of the rich ladies in this painting are more elaborate and showy, and more. Of course, there's more modest apparel being worn by the local folk. But unfortunately, I could not find a copy of that particular portion of the painting. Almost the same time as the Basi Revolt paintings were done, the first formal Filipino art school, the Academia de Dibujo y Pintura, was founded between 1821 and 1834 by a Chinese mestizo named Damian Domingo, who introduced the style of painting we have come to know today as miniaturismo, a very detailed style of painting which, after the Qing dynasty scroll was presented in this conference, is nothing really earth-shakingly new. Neither is it exclusively Filipino, as we may have learned it from the Chinese painters who were brought to the country by Spanish friars. Something also is known to us of the methods used by the artists of Domingo's time. They polished the canvas to an extreme by first covering it with a thin layer of gesso. On this, they worked with loving hands, as if every inch were a miniature. These early paintings favored the miniature style and chose, if not confined to do so, until European teachers and European-trained Filipino painters arrived and other art schools were firmly established. After Domingo's death, sometime in the mid-1800s, the school closed, but the Spanish government revived it as the Academia de las Bellas Artes. And sent for two Spanish painters, Cortina and Nieto, to head the faculty. So many Filipinos by this time were proficient in painting. There was no trouble finding native teachers to assist the two foreigners. Little is known of Cortina Nieto, but Agustin Saez and Lorenzo Rocha, who joined the faculty in 1846, succeeded them and became the teachers of two of the most famous Filipino painters of the 19th century, Juan Luna and Felix Resurrección Hidalgo. These two very influential painters of the late 19th century would later be schooled in Europe and would be greatly influenced by the European academic style that was prevalent during this period, bringing to the country a distinct brand of romanticism and realism that would herald modernism in Philippine painting. Some of the more important portraitists of this era were Juan Arceo, Severino Flores, and of course another form seemed to have evolved, no? But all towards the 19th century, this was how the Filipina was idealized. And of course, the genre paintings of everyday life became more and more pronounced. But then there are really some icons which we can't shake off. Notice that these are renderings of course, the Blessed Virgin. Notice that she has a bulbous skirt, a shortish blouse, and something to cover her bosom. Because the Virgin Mary is dressed that way, that is why the Filipina is dressed that way. It is an assemblage, it is the same assemblage, the same four pieces of clothing. Why this is so can only be attributed to the fact that no other dress form in the world even remotely resembles the Philippine dress. It is the Filipina's recognition of her identity, an identity she wears as elegantly as she wears her barot saya. Her tapis and her panuelo, like as if it were a second skin. The Filipina in Philippine dress is one instance wherein it is the dress that defines the icon and wherein the icon defines the painting. Maraming salamat po. Muchas gracias. Many thanks.